Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started here. We have a few more people filtering in. My name is Lydia Malama Johnson. I'm the executive director of APAD and the Photography Show, and I am so happy to welcome Drew Sawyer and Vera Lutter today for our talk on In the Now, Gender and Nation in Europe. And I want to just give a brief introduction for our speakers today, and then I'll hand it over to them for a much more interesting conversation than anything I'm going to say about this exhibition. On the left is Vera Lutter. She graduated in '91 from the Department of Sculpture at the Academy of Fine Arts Munich and received her MFA in 1995 from the School of Visual Arts, New York. She began by experimenting with ways to capture the most direct possible impression of her surroundings. She then converted her room in which she was living into a pinhole camera, transforming it into an apparatus for recording its own appearance. This established an enduring guideline of altering her images as little as possible after their initial creation. She decided to retain the negative view her process generated and refrain from creating multiple versions or reproductions. Her recent solo shows include, in 2022, Vera Lutter Museum in the Camera at LACMA in Los Angeles, and in 2015, Vera Lutter Inverted Worlds from the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and New Orleans. Her recent series of work, photographing the Acropolis, began as a commission from retiring New York Times editor Kathy Ryan. We're pleased to welcome her as one of the featured artists of the In the Now, Gender and Nation in Europe exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. In conversation with her is Drew Sawyer, one of the curators of the exhibition. He is the Sondra Gilman Curator of Photography at the Whitney Museum of American Art. He worked on this exhibition in his previous role at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, where the exhibition is currently open. Before that, he was at MoMA and the Columbus Museum of Art, where he founded the Center for Art and Social Engagement through a major grant of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We're thrilled to welcome you both for this conversation. Thank you for being with us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us to be here, and thank you all for taking a break from the fair to come listen. Vera, it's great to be in conversation with you today. I'm a little bummed that Hedgie isn't joining us because I think it would have been a lot of fun, but we'll have to do that another time. So just a little bit of background first on the exhibition itself. I didn't really bring in slides. I hope you all have a chance to go to the Brooklyn Museum to see the show. It was organized jointly with LACMA and started there in 2021. And it's based on a collection, as it says, of Fehrs Haukohl, who's a Houston-based collector. His family has historically predominantly collected Venetian painting from the 17th century. And that collection has traveled extensively around Europe and elsewhere. And Mark started collecting photography in the early 2000s, sort of thinking about what he could collect himself in relation to his family's collection. And one thing he was interested in as a collector in the US, but still interested in European art, was he felt a lot of women photographers who were based in Europe were not being collected by institutions or being shown in galleries in the early 2000s, and basically over the last 20 years has kind of attempted to systematically collect the work by women either born or working in Europe. So some artists were born in Europe and are now based in New York, like Vera, or based elsewhere in the US or in the world. In other cases, it's artists who were not born in Europe at all, but migrated to Europe for various reasons over the last several decades. And he basically systematically went country by country and collected a work by a handful of artists to kind of be representative of all of Europe, excluding Russia, which is maybe important to say that he decided not to include Russia. And the parameters, right, so it's work by women artists that are based or born there, making work after the year 2000s. So for Mark Haukohl, this was really a way to create a time capsule of photographic practices by women born or based in Europe. This collection entered into the Brooklyn Museum and LACMA's collection in 2021. It took many, many years of negotiation between both institutions and the collector. So the collection is jointly held, which is pretty rare for institutions. It's not split 50-50. There's over 200 works. They're jointly owned. Half of them are stored at the Brooklyn Museum. Another half are held at LACMA. And each institution has a 50-50 stake in every single individual work. So that's part of the reason why it took both institutions' general councils many years to kind of come to agreements about the terms of the gift and the sharing jointly. I'm happy to answer more questions about that at the end if anyone is curious. It was the first time I had to deal with anything like that. But anyway, so for today in the show that I should say, Britt Salveson and Eve Schillo at LACMA were the co-curators, and I worked together to bring in the collection, and they really had initiated it, and Brooklyn in a way kind of stepped in a couple years after they were already in conversations with Mark Haukohl. And when we decided to do a show, which was part of the gift agreement, as they often are, we were thinking about what's a way to organize. He was very open to any sort of organizational strategies that we wanted for the exhibition. And as you can see from the title, it says gender. Is this working? It says gender and nation in Europe. So one of the things we were really thinking about is the sort of categories that Mark created for his collection, the sort of parameters, right? It had to be women artists, right? So gender. He was looking at Europe, and especially after the year 2000, so already after the European Union. So we were interested in that sort of tension between an idea of nationalism, right? He went country by country and basically selected a handful of artists. And what does that mean, right? Because some of these artists, as I said, were not born in Europe, were not born in a specific country, migrated within or migrated to the US. And then, of course, photography, which after the year 2000 is something quite expansive, right? So the show itself kind of interrogates those three categories that Mark Haukohl set up. So I figured today, the sort of structure of the conversations can kind of be around those categories and thinking about, one thing Britt and Eve and I were interested while we were organizing the show was thinking about what do these categories mean to the artists, right? Do any of the artists identify as, say, photographers rather than artists using photography, and what is that distinction? Or do many of the artists feel that their gender is a sort of defining aspect of their artistic practice or their nationality? So I thought, so this afternoon we'll kind of use that structure in a way to sort of talk about Vera's work and also kind of bringing out connections to the show. So I thought we'd begin with, in the intro mentioned that you studied sculpture. So why photography, or how did you come to photography as your primary practice in the 1990s?
Thank you, Drew, for this nice introduction. How did I come to do photography? Yes, I studied sculpture in Munich. I received a grant from the German government to spend 9 months in New York, a post-graduation grant. That grant requested that I'm enrolled into a school. So I signed up for a photography program. Never mind, this is like, I received the grant, I think 91 or 92, then there's a little bit of rollover time until you arrive in New York. It was 93. We artists were still printing our portfolios by hand. We would take them to a photo lab and say, you print this and that for us. So I thought, okay, I've been in art school long enough. Don't really want to have any further discussion about art in school, but learn something practical, how to print my portfolio. So I ended up in photo school in New York. This just to say that I was surrounded by students who knew photography very, very well, and I didn't know it at all. At the time, schools still had dark rooms. and I enjoyed experimentation. And so basically what I did is what Lydia kind of touched on in her introduction. I grew up studying sort of conceptual art. And I thought, okay, here I am in New York. I had a sublet lease somewhere in the garment district, shared that space with another artist. And as I learned much later, it was an illegal sublet in a commercial building, but we had this beautiful loft space with an amazing view all over the garment district, Midtown Manhattan. So I sat in this bird's nest-like situation looking at this new environment that had become my world for what was assumed to be 9 months, and I decided to use that space to record my initial personal experience in New York. So I turned the loft I lived in into a camera. I actually, in the beginning, tried to work with sculpture. So you turn a space into a camera obscura by making everything dark. I put a little pinhole on the window surface, and then I tried to expose onto canvas that I painted with an emulsion, with a photographic emulsion, and I wanted to take that canvas then and basically stretch it around structures and kind of make sculptures. I could never get that going. It's kind of difficult to work with this liquid emulsion, and I was so completely inexperienced with photography that at some point I threw up my arms in despair and said, enough of this. I just want to record the image. I've tried so hard, 6 weeks. I was cooking the emulsion. I had a loft bed, and I was cooking the emulsion with the red light underneath my bed, and then would paint it onto the canvas, wait until sunrise the next morning to do my exposure. Anyway, it never worked, and so instead of working with this photographic emulsion on canvas, I decided I just throw up photographic paper. And that, again, after quite some effort, led to my first image, and I really was excited about what I had made, and I discussed it with fellow students, and there was kind of a lot of interest, so I thought, let's try again. And that's almost 30 years ago, and here we are.
How long was the exposure, do you remember?
It's a very good question. So the liquid light, that's what this emulsion is called, exposure, I never figured out, and I think it's part of, I just had no idea. My photographic exposure onto paper was 6 hours, and it kind of took me 3 weeks to get there. I lived with a photographer who had gone to photo school, who knew everything. He said, "You are crazy, you're exposing for 10 minutes, everything will be completely overexposed." I kind of inched forward, eventually 6 hours it was, yeah. And I started, so people in school, you know, where you mix chemistry and where you use the dark rooms, they were a little impatient with me because I really had no idea how anything worked. Developers, stop, fix, all those things I'd kind of never heard about. And they said, hey, why don't you start with an 8x10? And I said, no. I have a camera obscura, and the image will reflect the architecture with which I worked because it's about my environment and where I live. And this piece is 8 feet by 8 feet, and that's what I'm doing. So, yeah, that was my first image.
And I'm curious, were you quite familiar with the camera obscura, its history, kind of other uses? Was this something you came into kind of school knowing that existed, or something you learned along the way? Like, how did you arrive at that?
That's a great question. I had a fellow student in Munich who was is probably a very intelligent and philosophical man, and he installed a camera obscura to comment on painting. He installed that in the Munich Academy and invited me to visit, and I was like, whoa, really? I was very fascinated with the concept. The direction he was going to take his art piece with this camera was very different, but that's when I really first saw and experienced it.
And I'm curious how you saw, I mean, coming from Germany and working, where you didn't study photography, but of course, by the early 90s, Germany was really at the forefront of contemporary photography with, you think of the Dusseldorf School. Already, many of those artists were beginning to show in New York. The sort of, rise of prominence of the big picture photography, color photography of the 1990s. How you saw your work in relation to that, and then maybe also amongst your peers at SVA or just broadly in New York when you were practicing, like how you saw that, this kind of first foray into the medium relating to what other people had been doing.
So I experimented with photography when I was in Munich, and there was a really great photography, it was a workshop in the Academy of Fine Arts. The structure is kind of different from grad school here. And I took a class there, and I kind of went to this workshop where we could use the facilities. And, but I made mostly collage work, and I had it printed by labs that were everywhere at the time. I had a friend, she was a very good photographer and on her way to photo school, and we did things together. And there was that famous Stuttgart Photography Prize that we applied to. We were not accepted, and Thomas Struth got the gold medal. Just to say, yes, large format German photography, but I sort of came from a different angle. I like to make things. The Dusseldorf School, I think, had a different approach from how I kind of wiggled my way into photography. So at this point, of course, I know all these artists and I have great respect for them, but I think it's quite a different approach, yeah. And here in New York, when I arrived, there was the first wave, I would say, about identity. There was a lot of talk about gender and identity, contextualizing with language. My fellow students worked a lot with writing and photography. Sort of the straightforward image making wasn't so, people didn't engage in that, I think, generally speaking.
I mean, I was gonna ask this later, but it kind of leads in because, of course, the show itself, as I mentioned, is organized around identity categories, right? Gender and nation, primarily, but of course, photography maybe is also a medium identity category. But so I'm curious, like when you started doing, and we can maybe look at some of your pictures, right? Because some of you, of course, have largely photographed architectural sites. And of course, those architectural sites carry their own sort of historical weight in some cases, or in many cases, and sometimes tied directly to European history and or industry. And then in other cases, I'm also really interested in, some of your first photographs were of airports and places of transportation and globalization. And anyway, so I'm interested if you saw your work engaging in kind of identity categories in that way, or in a different way, but still kind of getting at those issues.
I mean, I think that all artwork that anyone makes who is serious about what they are making is personal. And therefore, directly or indirectly, the identity is always involved. I can't really say if no, I don't think that was a kind of a primary concern of mine. I apologize, I got a little distracted by the voices outside. What was your follow-up question?
Yeah, it was just more about like if noticing, as you said, that many of your peers in school, and right, it was the early mid 1990s. You think of right the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which is seen as the sort of marker of identity politics in the New York art world, at least. And yeah, if there was any way in which you saw your interest in some of the specific subjects as an investigation of forms of identity, whether that's like national, European identities and histories, or gender. I don't know, we can get to that later though.
We get into that later, for sure, yeah. So where identity, but it's sort of 2 steps removed, I would say, comes into my work, is I inhabit my room-size cameras for hours and hours and hours during the exposures because I sort of live with my exposure and supervise and affect the image making from within the camera. And therefore my physical presence in this isolated space really, and it's been sort of touched on but not extensively written on, has a performative character and value. And it is, just a very strong and important and isolating experience to be in these dark spaces for so long in order to do what I wanted to do. And I think that's kind of identity defining or identity describing, if you wish.
I guess it's interesting. I mean, do you think of your work as, in a way, performance, or do you feel like the process itself of creating a camera obscura, producing the image over many hours, is as important as the final object?
Maybe not, because I think I would have probably preserved it more if I felt that way. It's kind of as important because without it, the image wouldn't be there, but what I preserve and what I exhibit is the image. Yeah. And that's sort of what survives, yeah, other than the narrative.
So maybe I want to look at a few of these. Oh, it is now working, good. This is great. So maybe we can start with some of the first images. This is not quite the order. So here, which I was mentioning, some of your early work includes airports. So I'm curious how you came to this kind of subject matter, right? You're using shipping containers in some cases, you're looking at airports, right? Sort of sites of global transportation and globalization.
It's, so interesting that you would come with this word. What was on my mind, so I started with this work in 1997 when I started to photograph in shipyards. The first air base was an American air base in northern Germany where the American military was in the process of pulling out. And for me, I don't know if the word globalization was even out there. It was not in my vocabulary, I think. But what interested me was the spanning of the distance. I had come from Europe and I'd landed in New York, and as you can tell, my stay has outlasted those 9 months. I never went back. And but it's an incredibly defining experience. I came all by myself. I have no family in this country. I knew nobody. I picked up a new medium. I tried to establish myself as an artist, as a woman artist in New York City. And yet, culturally, I was formed by such a different place. And my interest in photographing in those locations was basically to create an amalgam that describes how we span distances, how we go from one place to the other, how we live, also merchandise and people. So globalization is kind of probably in there. It's too long ago to say if I had that vocabulary, but definitely in that field of thought.
And I'm curious, we have some pictures of, you brought in photographs of the actual shipping containers you've used. Well, here's maybe one example. So yeah, I'm curious how you came upon the idea of using shipping containers.
Well, exactly how you said, it fits in perfectly into the idea of spanning distances, shipping, being here, coming from there, wanting to be there, being here, can you afford it, can you not afford it, can you go home, where's the family, all that conversation, and the shipping container being kind of a housing and a symbol of transportation came in perfectly, and it fulfilled exactly what I needed. A box, that I could place. And I've also spoken about the idea, which is equally important to me, that, the emptiness of the shipping container or of the airplane or of the ship sort of fulfills its purpose. We can fill it and then use it for transportation. The emptiness of my camera obscura conveys light into tangible image. So I like to kind of bring those two characteristics together and relate them in my work. Yeah, here, this was ambitious, and I've just spoken to someone about this. I forget in what context, but this was an ambitious project where we had to put the shipping container on a small mountain, and in order for it to achieve enough height to photograph the radio telescope that I was interested in.
Yeah, it looks like not an easy place to set up your camera obscura. And I imagine, but that's probably true of many of the locations you've done since leaving your apartment.
Absolutely true, absolutely true. Like this fabulous curator I worked with at LACMA, she wrote a beautiful essay, and she said it takes a village to make an image, by Vera Lutter. And that's really, that adds into the performative character that is hugely important. So many aspects have to fall into place. So many people have to do what they can do best in order for, at the end of the story, there to be an image.
I imagine it became much more difficult to do this kind of work at airports after 9/11. Did you continue? Are there images that you continued after? I'm just curious, it just made me.
No, my airport project became so famous, and that was thankfully long before 9/11. Well, not so long, really. I did the work, as I said, I started the work in 97, and the big Frankfurt project was in April and May of 2001, so very close to 9/11. I usually don't go back to do it again because of what we just said, the effort is enormous. I'd made a fulfilling body of work in Frankfurt and in this American Air Base in 97. I've been asked to work, people wanted me to work in airports again. I think there were 3 conversations, San Francisco, Toronto, and Tampa, but where I was supposed to be invited, but I'm not really interested. It's so hard to make an image that I would rather move on to another subject. And I believe those venues also didn't sort of offer what I would have been interested had I gone back. And largely, I could say, the world, I don't know when you were born, a couple of older folks here, and the world has changed entirely after 9/11. And anything about my work has become so much more complicated. And the work I did in Frankfurt will never happen again, never.
Yeah. Yeah,
Sadly.
I figured it must have been, look, just looking at these dates, it's 99, 2000, 2001, the early part, right? May, this one's May 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And what took you to this radio telescope? Like, what was it about?
Well, there
You had to go to the top of the mountain, crank in this shipping container.
I was just so interested in the parallel imaging. So quite frankly, I was hoping to photograph a photographic telescope, but I couldn't find one where they would grant me access. And these people in Germany who I found through a contact at the university were incredibly kind and welcoming, but they operate a radio telescope, so largely radio waves, right? I was incredibly interested to sort of observe with my, if you wish, rudimentary, kind of very basic system of image making, observe this unbelievable instrument that listens into the far reaches of the universe in unison with many other radio telescopes all over the world, reaching, basically that's what they do, researching the origins of the universe and of, what's it called? The spiral we live in, our galaxy. So I felt it was just so poetic to me, the idea that my box would sit on the top of the mountain and observe this amazing instrument that is basically directed by these fabulously interesting astrophysicists to research, the origins of our universe, which is also the origins of light, of course, because the stars they research have long ago burned out, right?
And how many images did you make over the course? Did you feel like in this case, for all the effort it took to take it up there, you really needed to produce many images?
I like to make many images just because then when this process starts, my own work informs my mind. It's not unlike a painter, right? You do something and you go like, yay, this is what I should do next and that I could do better. I think I made what I called 17 exposures. I count them all and I number them with Roman numbers. I may have taken 2 or 3 out, which I thought were unsuccessful. This is over the course of 2 months, I would say. But it's not really the desire to make as much as I can, but it's a working process. If I didn't have a life, which I hardly do outside of my work, but the people who help me usually do, and they want to go back home, and it gets all too expensive, and people from the university and the telescope probably wanted to get rid of me at some point, but I would still be there because it gets more and more interesting and I can experiment more and more with what I do.
Yeah, like this image, what's exactly happening at the top?
Yeah, what's happening at the top? What's happening at the top is what I'm doing inside the camera during the exposure, which is a sort of dodge and burn with a not solid but semi-translucent object. And I kind of wanted to create that relationship between what is obviously portrayed as the sky, as the universe above us, in relationship to the disk. What is it called? The telescope? There's a name for it. Dish. Thank you so much. I'm still suffering from jet lag, and that makes access to language difficult.
I want to come back to this question of other, in particular, architectural sites you've photographed over the years. And this idea of memory, and in particular maybe national memory or even, say, regional memory, of course. You've photographed, I think you have some in here now, fairly kind of iconic architectural sites in Germany, in Venice, in Italy. Is this the first one? Sorry.
We've seen them all now.
We've seen them all.
Yeah,
I think it's
a few times.
It's a different slideshow, so I don't know the order.
But we stick with the industrial sites in Germany. Shall we do that? Or
Sure.
did you
If you want to stick in
to
German,
someone-
obviously Germany makes sense.
I'm just asking
Yeah.
you if you wanted to go
Yeah.
somewhere else with your
No, well, I
question.
was going to look at some of the other architectural sites, but we can start with, we can stick with Germany for now.
Drew sent me his excellent questions. I appreciate them, and I studied them, and I wrote some things down.
Yeah.
And in one of your questions, if I may paraphrase, you asked to what degree my upbringing in Germany had informed my choices of image making. And I grew up in the Ruhr Valley, the very heavily industrial center of Germany, so not far from Düsseldorf, where the Beckers lived and worked and photographed their beautiful water towers and many other very characteristic things of that region. And I wasn't born in that area. I was born in a small town near Frankfurt, and then my parents moved there to Bochum, which is in this. It's like the Rust Belt of Germany, coal mining, which allowed for steel fabrication, of course, before the 2000s, before 1990. And we moved into an area that was so incredibly, heavily, insanely industrial that I think it really affected my imagination and my mind as a young person. Because those are the first images I turned to after starting with New York City and my environment here. And if I could, I would still make such images because they're just very, very present in my imagination. And I think they have formed me. That environment has formed me. It's all gone from the Ruhr Valley in Germany. It's all cleaned up. It's all either, is it called SeaWorld? Or, art spaces or performance spaces, all these industrial buildings, or knocked down. So it's all gone, not unsimilar to New York City. We had lots of active factories here, or decaying buildings, or power stations when I moved to New York. Very little of that is left. But anyway, the enormity of these structures, there's something frightening about them, and there is something sublime about them, and all of that just interested me profoundly. And that was sort of the reason why I went to these subjects, yeah.
Did you see it as an interest in sort of national memory, or this is really more personal?
It's personal, I think.
Yeah.
It's personal. And it took all those images that I made for me to understand that, yeah. The understanding was after the making, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, but obviously you've done the Pantheon and other sort of architectural sites. So I'm curious about, your turn to more well-known sites.
Yeah, that's sort of, we were speaking, 30 years, right? So let's make it 25 in between. That's sort of, and there's a lot in between. And I look at the Pantheon and I look at the temples in Paestum. Venice is a different subject that I've photographed, or the Greek and Roman wing that I was invited to photograph at the Metropolitan Museum. That is a process of internalization in my own interests. So I feel like as a younger person, when I was still coping with where am I, how did this happen, where do I come from, where do I live, what happens in between transportation, voyage, shipping, globalization, as you say, right, was my theme. Architecture, metropolitan sites, inspired by New York. But then, it's kind of a turning in, and I started to photograph quite a bit of artwork. And I look at these places as, artwork, which they are, architectural artwork. So, and human history, of course. That's sort of how I got to these sites. I know when you look at this work, it kind of gives another impression. I've also photographed the Chrysler building here, but I'm not really a photographer who photographs one specific site. These sites I photographed for their artistic value. The Chrysler building I wanted to photograph because I thought it's not going to take much longer and it's going to be gone.
Right, covered.
You know,
Yeah.
All New York vistas have disappeared, and there's just one big mess of bad architecture now, according to me, right? But normally I would not, you know, when you look at my work, it's always a much more global kind of general intake of imagery.
Last one. Here's another one. I mean, it's interesting because I'm also thinking like many of these sites, of course, are still connected to histories of global trade or empire and the things that, you know, could be read into your early images as well. I don't know if that's something like a through line or if that's something you're thinking about at all.
Well, Venice started with my wanting to photograph the city reflected in its own imagery. And I went to photograph San Marco flooded, the Piazza San Marco flooded, which is the lowest elevation in Venice. And when they had the floods, which supposedly they have less of now, we wait for a moment, right? We'll let this play out. There seems to be a traffic jam on our block,
so,
right? Yeah.
I think they can't get by it.
It's going to get worse. Okay. Anyway, so I went to Venice to photograph Piazza San Marco underwater, and it's sort of a architectural and photographic idea that I had, because when the piazza is flooded, and the water is entirely still, which is what happens then, you know, first there's a full moon and a high tide and often a storm, and the water comes in, and then the weather goes bad and everything goes very, very still, and you have this still low elevation of water in the piazza, and it's basically like a mirror. And so it's both, you know, a photographic reflection as much as an architectural reflection of being there. And that's the image I got. It's in the Houston Museum now. And I got a few others, and then of course I was inspired because the beauty of Venice is just beyond, and you know, calming it down in one of my images. My exposures are very long usually. They're days, hours, sometimes weeks. And that's why you don't see people or movement in my work. And that's the beauty of, you know, making an image in Venice, which is always, you know, impossibly crowded, obviously. We've all been there, we've all experienced that. And then I can calm it down and kind of freeze that aspect of it and give it back to us as a still image, still in every way.
I mean, hearing you think about that, and even just thinking about Venice, right, a city that is sinking, do you see your work as documentary?
You know, I kind of like the aspect of it. It's not how I go in. I'm not saying, hey, I'm going to document New York City now, but I like the aspect of it being a document. For instance, Dia invited me to do a collaboration with the Dia Center for the Arts in the late 90s. They had just found the Nabisco factory in Beacon and were thinking about, or I guess they had finished thinking and started doing, but anyway, they took possession of it. And it was before they converted it into the beautiful museum that it is today. And they invited me to photograph there. And so I feel like those are documents of what it looked like. They serve as documents, yes, they do.
Yeah.
You know, an altered document, of course, because it's a negative and it's a large image and certain areas out of focus, but they are, yeah.
Well, I want to shift in the remaining time that we have for the last topic, which we really haven't addressed, which is gender. So I'm curious if your gender position you feel like is important for your work, or even just in terms of your being as an artist, right? If that's something that you are thinking about that is embedded in your work in any way.
I think no woman that does anything within society, you know, does not think about that, because it's an immediate direct experience, right? And you have to establish yourself within a society that, you know, I'm older, right? Definitely the Germany where I grew up was very, very white male dominated. The art world, I would say, was incredibly sexist. The Academy of Fine Arts where I studied did not have a single female teacher. You know, so it's all stuff that seems apocalyptic today, but that's, you know, it's a generation. It's kind of a generation ago. So I think for any thinking woman, that's a topic, and it is for me, for sure. I've sort of never directly articulated it in my work, and I've always been very surprised that I believe nobody has ever written about it. Nobody has ever touched on it. When I've photographed in shipyards, I've spent 2 months in December in northern Germany. It was just, you know, Germany had just reunited, so it was an Eastern German shipyard that was on its last leg, photographing there. And I was sitting in my container there alone amongst, I think, 2,000 men. And I would go into the cafeteria with these 2,000 men for lunch, you know, and it's an absolutely defining, incredible experience. They, of course, all thought I was completely insane, and we had nothing in common, nothing. And so these are pretty profound experiences that I'll never forget, and I think maybe sort of as I'm getting older and will make less of this work, I might want to write some of these things down. And it surprises me that in the effort, in the undertaking, in the guiding, you know, if you wish, the village that it takes for me to make one image, as Jenny King said, I might be the mayor of that village. Nobody's ever written about that mayor, right? Or whatever.
You're really giving out a lot of topics that somebody listening out there can pick up and write an essay.
Yeah, I love that. Okay.
Great. Well, I'm conscious of time, so I do want to open it up to you all to see if you have any questions.
Hi. Yeah, speaking about LACMA, you know, you did your residency and dedicated yourself to really capturing.
Can you speak a little louder because it's so noisy out there?
Yeah, so you did your residency and dedicated yourself in capturing LACMA and all of the spaces and the architecture and the artworks themselves. And I'm just curious, with the new building coming, would you be interested in perhaps capturing this new space? It doesn't really have a history yet, but it's this new thing that's taking over Wilshire that everyone's interested in.
I would have been interested in photographing a moment in the process of construction, because it's such an outland. I mean, at least in the process of construction, it looks like a pretty outlandish building, incredibly complicated to construct as I go over Wilshire Boulevard and all of that. my time in Los Angeles ended when COVID hit. And that was just a very difficult time for most people on this planet, I would say, and for museum directors especially. And I was not going to ask Michael Govan to give me another spot somewhere to, I know everybody worked incredibly hard to keep the ship on course. Funds dropped away, work slowed down, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I don't have to tell you these things. So I was just not, it didn't seem the moment to go back and say, I would like to, and when I come, when I visit, life on that side gets much more complicated. It's like I'm not an easy guest. I'm not a photographer with a handheld camera that comes for one day, switches the lights on and off, is annoying, makes a room too hot or too cold, and then goes away. I'm much more annoying than that, if you wish, So Michael really, who is a dear friend and a fantastic advocator for art, and artists for many, many people, not just for me. He really gone out of his way to together with me and his team and my team, realize the project we've done and the show we've done. It felt like it was enough. Just don't ask more questions, that kind of thing. And there was a moment, and that moment happened during COVID as the building was in its most abstract. They had basically all scaffolding and no skin yet on that building, and that would have been the moment. But as I said, could have been a good image, yeah. Yeah.
Hi guys, thank you for your talk. Sorry, it's very loud. I was really excited hearing you speak, Vera, about your work. It made me realize that you complicate reproduction, obviously, like photographic reproduction, in the fact that you don't make positives. It made me also think that you complicate then a relationship between the images that you make and then what they relate to, like the places or the original. We call that the referent. Could you talk about that? Is that something it's a theoretical kind of, I think, strength, but it's also an artistic, photographic kind of outcome that's really exciting to me.
Would you repeat the question?
I didn't hear all of it.
Yeah, I think
okay.
the acoustics are a little bad.
Oh, sorry.
Would you say it again?
Yeah,
please?
let me summarize it real quick. Could you talk about you make negatives in a way. They're inverted images, so they're not positive reproductions as one would expect of a place. I find that fascinating because then it complicates the relationship between the images that you make and what they refer to.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I should have probably addressed that earlier. When I made my first image in this loft that I occupied in New York City, my idea was to invite the view in as directly as possible and not interfere with, interfere as little as possible. And that's why I retained the negative. And retaining the negative means retaining the reversed sides. I sort of turned the image upside down, if you wish, right in the camera. It, of course, comes in also upside down. But I thought I wanted to give back as much as recognizable as possible to engage the viewer to a degree that he or she or they feel invited, right? And on the other hand, I like that there's a certain estrangement. I don't really know if that's a real word in the English language, but I like to remove my image one step from the immediate obvious reality, again, to sort of make it more mysterious, and in that invite the viewer in more. A straightforward document can be so easily and quickly be passed by. Oh yeah, of course, I know. Mm-hmm. Next.
But
right?
it's, I mean, to build up that, it's also in some way a less mediated image, right? I mean, it's a more straightforward document because, of course, for any normal film camera, right? One, there's multiple processes to get to the final image that looks more like reality. So is that, I mean, are you interested in that? I mean, it sounded like that first image, you were interested in that really unmediated, direct experience over the image that more directly relates to reality, even though it would have been much more mediated.
Yeah, exactly right. It's, in a way, it's kind of a oxymoron a little bit that I say I want to be as direct and as straightforward and as immediate an image as possible, and then what I give back is actually a very altered version of reality. But so it is, yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
You have to ask him questions too, right? You know?
Well, whoever wants to answer.
Okay.
And if it's somebody in the audience also, anybody. Of course, there's one aspect of the work that is very meditative and quiet because of the duration. So, weeks, are you kidding? I mean, that's easy to sleep through a whole day of exposure. The other side is that, it's not only what you do, it's how you do it. That's the how you do it. But the what you do, when you photograph carved antiquities, or when you photograph temples like Sunyan, Poseidon's temple, you're photographing projections of power of those societies that made them. This is how power is projected. A huge statue or a great temple far larger than anyone's home or anything anyone had seen in those times, so that when the barefoot peasant comes, he thinks only God could live there. Then, of course, you go on to industrial stuff, which in the era of capitalism is the projection of power. And so it goes when transportation and globalization, as you bring up, is the projection of power. Are you thinking of that sort of political meaning in those periods? Or is it just beautiful, exotic, wonderful subject matter?
Of course I think about the political meaning, but also about the cultural. These temples were not just representations of political power. Pestum, the Greeks in 400 before Christ, Greece, the country got too small, so they started, colonizing, and they landed in southern Italy. And the first thing they do is they build a massive temple. That is, I don't know, right? It's an investigation myself. I don't know. Are they saying we are so powerful, or we want a place of worship for our spirituality? Because a temple, had an inner sanctum, which was a place of worship. And that is sort of, never mind the women couldn't get in, it was an all-male place. I know all of that, right? But that's more what interests me. And, what do we do today when we get to a place? We destroy it, basically, right? We build a highway and dump the gasoline on the side of the road and kill all the animals and the plants. And, that's sort of, it's more like, what was that society thinking? What were they seeing in it?
As we sit in an old room with pictures of dead white military guys gazing down at us.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
It's made me
gender conversation. I love it.
Part of the gender conversation about
Yeah.
changing. I'm fascinated of the industrial sites and the military sites, which, as you sort of mentioned, are all pretty much all mainly masculine. And to have you give, for lack of a better term, a feminine or a woman's view of that, I think is very interesting, because they are in this environment not even feeling that. But I just find that really fascinating, that you've placed yourself in environments that are basically, in those two examples, male. And then you have if there exists a female vision of that, but then also to have it reverse printed, which is another way to turn around the site. So I just found that a very interesting concept, that you're photographing very masculine places from a woman's perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, and it's very true. I sometimes wonder about that myself. You know, this is like, you know, in one question that I guess we didn't get to talk about, you asked about other artists.
Yeah, other women artists.
Women artists.
That might have been important for you, both in photography, but even when you were studying sculpture, and your work still is so sculptural. But
I was thinking about a male artist. I don't really know where I was going with this, but it was more, how did you see your work in photography relating to the work of your peers, both using photography and, say, in sculpture or other media? There was no gender in that question.
yeah, later on there was.
Later, I know it comes, but here I answer. You know, Richard Serra, wrestling with the sublime, exploring the romanticism within the sublime. And that's sort of maybe relating to you know, what you touched on. Richard became a friend, and so I really wanted to end my talk with a photograph I made last year in Beacon. Can you go one back? Yeah. I've, with his permission, got to photograph his installations, his sculptures in Beacon, and of course, you know, I feel like there must be a relationship, right? There must be something we have in common, that he wrestles with these enormous masses of steel, balancing them on the ground, and my surprising desire to go through so much trouble to photograph these male sites, right? These male-dominated, very masculine sites. So I feel like in some ways, by inhabiting my exposures and by spending so much time within that projected image, I kind of appropriate that world, calm it down, make it mine, and kind of give myself the idea of being able to control it. I mean, this is, you know, poetic language, I would say, obviously, you know, paraphrasing, but that must have something to do with it. Taming a very, not least scary, powerful world.
So we have one more question.
Hi, I'm curious if you feel like the masculinity of these spaces change when you photograph them versus when you're beholding them.
Ooh.
Sorry, I didn't mean for that to be like an interview question.
Would you just give me a guess? What do you mean with beholding them?
In person, when you're shooting the site versus when you've captured it in a photograph, and when you're looking at the photograph.
I've always thought about, you know, when I started and worked in New York, my first images, and I was really madly in love with the city and felt so liberated having come here from my controlled, small, white German world. You know, and I was just poor as a church mouse, but I felt like with bringing home an image from Lower Manhattan, it was mine. You know, it's a form of appropriation. Then I hang it in my studio, I look at it, and it's my world, right? It's my world, it's how I see the world, it's how I want to look at it. And Your question was the experience different from the reality to the beholding? Could you say it again?
Well, just that whether the masculinity of the spaces that you view as masculine change when you photograph them.
Yeah, because I spend so much time with these spaces, I sort of, they become more familiar. And when they transfer into a tangible image, of course, it's a very different space. Then there comes this idea of it being mine, and I control it.
Thank you.
Yeah, he gives me like this, do you really look?
No, I'm also interested. I mean, I was also thinking about how even, right, the language of photography is both masculinist oftentimes, right? You're taking something or related to the military, you're shooting, right? But that would be hard, I feel like, to apply to the camera obscura, the way you're operating, right? It's almost more based on embodied, more like an embodied experience, right? You're there, it's this performance, it takes a long exposure time, you're not really capturing the thing, right? You're transforming it and inverting it in a different way. I don't know, it just made me kind of think about all the different ways that maybe you could play with that idea.
I appreciate that. Yeah. It's very true. And it's, yeah, you kind of decompose it into so many aspects. It's not, the image making. It's not one strictly technical, mechanical, predictable process.
Great. Well, thank you again for being here.
Thank you all.
And thank you all for coming.
Drew.
Yeah.